Hey up, right, I'm taking a bit of a break this week. I've been meaning to do this for a couple of months. I've not actually had any time off from running this channel for 16 months, not any meaningful time anyway, and I'm just tired. A couple of months ago, I sort of asked the YouTube platform some advice on how I should go about taking some time off. And what it suggested that I did was upload what it calls 2 evergreen videos that I've released in the past that have done very well. In fact, between the 2 of them, 2 of the videos that I'm going to put up this week, they've had well over 1 million views. Now, 2 months ago, when I first sort of started tinkering with the idea of doing this, I actually watched today's video, which I put out about 2 years ago now, and it made me feel a little bit ashamed because I gave out what I consider to be some very good advice in that video, and although I habitually follow some of it I hadn't, especially the bit at the beginning and the bit at the end. So I'm going to rerun that today. See what you think. You know, if it's something that you've already seen, I apologise. It's there mainly for the benefit of other people. As I said, this is still getting regular views, but YouTube thought that it could probably just do with a bit of a push to bring it to the forefront with the algorithm again. So here we go. Hey up. Right, this is a continuation actually from Wednesday's video. Originally, this is the video that I intended to make on Wednesday, but then I realised it was a slightly bigger subject than I'd initially anticipated, so I decided to split it up into 2 videos. Now, in the first 24 hours, that video received 361 comments. All from guys telling me, or most of them from guys telling me that, you know, the description that I'd given in that video pretty much summed up their experience of motorcycles and, you know, the story behind them riding motorcycles now. There were also a lot of accounts from people that are at that stage, you know, they've retired or about to retire and they're thinking of getting back into motorcycling, asking me all sorts of questions, which hopefully I'm going to answer towards the end of this video, some advice for people looking to come back into biking. Now, I believe that motorcycling, especially in your twilight years, for want of a better expression, is good for your health, both physical and mental. And there are actually some studies to back that up. I'm a great believer that if you don't use it, you'll lose it. My dad was a typical example of that. He retired at 60. He was always a reasonably fit man. He did a lot of work around the house, you know, DIY projects, that kind of thing. But we had a dog, Cindy, a little Cairn Terrier that he used to take out and walk every day. And in the first year, 18 months of retirement, he seemed to be thriving, you know, fit and healthier than I'd ever seen him. But then a few things happened. All the projects that he'd saved up for retirement had been completed. There was nothing else left for him to do around the house. And then our little dog, Cindy, the family dog, unfortunately passed away. Now, my mum and dad took the decision that they weren't going to get another dog because they're too tiring and they wanted to be able to travel abroad and do all the things that they'd looked forward to in retirement. But I saw from that point on a rapid deterioration in my dad's health, because without the dog and without those DIY projects, he lost his direction in life. And at the age of 65, whilst on holiday in Madeira, now I don't know personally, but apparently Madeira is quite a hilly, mountainous place. After a walk one afternoon, he had a heart attack and died. And it's always been my belief that if, you know, he'd just found some interest to keep him active, get him out and about instead of, you know, vegetating, it would have lasted a lot longer than he did. He became inactive in pursuance of enjoying his retirement, which I believe ultimately killed him. The human body is a marvellous, astounding piece of biomechanical engineering, but at any age, it does deteriorate if it's not used. Now, I'm sure we've all gone through periods in our youth where we were inactive and became sort of out of condition. But when you're younger, it's easier to sort of bring yourself back from the brink. Your body is younger, it's healthier, so it bounces back better. You can build muscle, bone and strength much more quickly without too much effort. As you get older, that becomes more difficult. I mean, this is not just my opinion. We all know the importance of staying active. Not just for physical health, but for mental health as well. Because, again, there have been a lot of studies done that suggest that physical fitness also aids mental fitness. Staying active is a win-win scenario. Now, in retirement, people deal with this situation in different ways. Some people don't bother at all, and we know what the effects of that can be. Some people take up golf or hiking, cycling. There's lots of ways that you can sort of deal with that inevitable decline in old age, or at least manage it. And either going back to motorcycling or taking up motorcycling in your older years can be a good alternative to taking up badminton or golf or cycling. I'm not saying it's the most efficient way of keeping yourself healthy and active, but it is a way of keeping yourself healthy and active. But I think one of the bonuses with motorcycle is that if you enjoy it, it's something that you will stick at, you will keep doing it. So the benefits will be long term. For a start, riding a motorcycle is not like driving a car. In a car, you just sit there and the only things really that move are your feet and your hands. On a motorcycle, you're using your entire body to control it. It's a sort of very gentle resistance exercise, and especially at periods where you get stuck in traffic, you're having to support the weight of that bike to stop it from falling over because the bike isn't moving. And again, it's a very gentle resistance training. That bike weighs a lot, and if it tips a little bit too far either way, it requires the strength of your legs and your core to keep it upright. So your body is constantly having to make little muscle movements to keep that bike upright. Even more so if you're carrying heavy luggage and or a pillion. And it doesn't end there. Dragging your bike out of your garage and getting it set ready for you to go on a journey, parking it up, removing it from parking spaces, hauling it up onto its centre stand. That requires quite a lot of strength to move and manhandle that bike around, because all it wants to do without your guidance is fall over. So if you're riding a motorcycle regularly, it's doing you some good. And it doesn't matter how old you are, as long as you're physically capable of riding a bike, and it doesn't have to be a big bike. To some degree, it's going to slow down that physical decline. It may even improve it, depending on where you are when you get back onto bikes. And I'll give some advice towards the end of this video about preparing yourself for riding again when you've not ridden for a long time. Now, I know that this is the case because I've experienced it myself during the lockdowns, and coming to springtime when you've perhaps not ridden for a few months, and the first time you pull the bike out of the garage, you think to yourself, God, I don't remember it being as heavy as this last year. I don't necessarily struggle with the bike, but I do sort of mentally register that it seems harder to move around than it did last year. And that's because during the winter months, while I've not been riding, those muscles have relaxed. To some extent, they've atrophied. But after a few days of riding in spring, you build that strength back in. Your muscle fortifies itself, and you wonder why you had a problem a few days earlier. So there's absolutely no doubt that there is a physical benefit to riding a motorcycle. Now, the other thing that sets a motorcycle apart from travelling in a car is that It involves a lot more of your body. As I said, that steering a motorcycle requires the weight of your whole body. You have to move around in order to steer that bike in the direction that you want it to go in. But there's more to it than that. It goes deeper. The way motorcycles are configured, it requires both arms and both legs to routinely control it. Your left leg for gear changes, your right leg for rear braking, your right hand for throttle control and front brake, your left hand for the clutch. And that requires mental acuity. You've got to be able to synchronise all those limbs for accurate and skillful control of the motorcycle, which requires mental acuity. It's exercising your brain. It also requires a lot more concentration to pilot a motorcycle. They're less forgiving than a car. Assessing the prevailing road conditions and judging speed when taking corners, that kind of thing, requires a lot more calculations from the brain than a car does, because your senses are constantly being stimulated, whereas you're insulated in a car. A car is much more stable because it's got 4 wheels. When you're on 2 wheels, your brain is constantly having to calculate all these various factors for safe negotiation of hazards. Your brain is constantly being exercised, and your brain is just like muscle, really. If you don't use it, you will eventually lose it. Without constant mental stimulation, your brain will atrophy in just the same way that muscles do. And motorcycling helps to keep your brain active. And there are other mental benefits to riding a motorcycle. I've always thought riding a motorcycle is the closest thing to flying without actually, getting into a plane and flying. It's a wonderful feeling. There's nothing else quite like it. It activates dopamine and serotonin in the brain, giving you an overall sense of well-being and pleasure, which again is good for your health. A motorcycle gives you a greater sense of freedom, not just because of the way it rides, but because of the convenience as well. I know a lot of people go on about how difficult and how expensive it is to get through your motorcycle tests these days. But the benefits, once you get past that process from motorcycling, I think far outweigh the hassle and expense of getting through your test. A motorcycle will pay you back. For a start, providing you choose the right sort of motorcycle, fuel consumption is much lower. It will pay you back in fuel over time. The motorcycles that are routinely run will do anything up to 100 miles to the gallon, compared to my car that does about 52 miles to the gallon. And then on top of that, there's parking fees, and the mental freedom of parking a motorcycle. For a start, most places you can park free. Now, I know some towns and cities do charge congestion charges and parking fees for motorcycles nowadays. Just avoid those areas. And I rarely, if ever, experience difficulty in finding somewhere to park a bike. You can put them almost anywhere. And then there are no time limits on your parking. Now, myself and my partner, we go around all over the place. We used to use the car a lot, but that one thing that's always on your mind when you arrive at a destination and you pay your fee, or maybe you've got free parking for a limited period of time, you're constantly watching the clock. It builds up anxiety as the day goes on. Not only that, it limits the amount of time you can spend anywhere. You're generally limited to 2 or 3 hours parking in most places. You don't have that with a bike. When Paula first started sort of riding pillion with me regularly, and we started just doing the things that we normally do in a car on a motorcycle, one of the comments that she first made was that it was just so refreshing to have the freedom to park up and then go about your business without having to watch the clock and worry about how long you've got left before you have to return to your vehicle. These may seem like little things, but they're actually quite liberating in this day and age. And once again, we shouldn't underestimate how good that is for your own mental health. Now, that's the positives of riding a motorcycle out of the way. Potential negatives. One thing that I constantly get thrown at me in the comments is, I think I'm a bit too old to be riding a motorcycle. I'm 75 or 79, or I have an underlying health condition which makes it impossible for me to ride a bike. But people, when they leave those sort of comments, rarely go into specifics, so I can't comment either way whether their concerns are valid. But I'm going to give you 3 examples that might put things into perspective for you. Since the lockdowns, generally when I'm filming, I have some very specific locations where I know I won't be disturbed to film various things for the videos that I make. And just towards the end of the lockdowns, I found myself trailing a guy on one of those cool little Suzuki van, a little 125 thing, really cool looking little bike. And I noticed something a bit odd about him. His helmet was wobbling about all over the place, and his shoulders and his elbows were making sort of weird movements. Now, I'll put my hand up to it. Initially, I thought he was on the way back from the pub. He'd had a bit too much to drink, so I thought I'd better give him some space. Now, I've never spoken to this guy, but I must have seen him 40 or 50 times since then, all on the same sort of roads, around the same areas. But that first time that I saw him, I realised after a while that, it couldn't have been drink, because his road manners were really good. He wasn't travelling fast, but he was keeping the bike nice and steady. His behaviour at junctions, etc., were impeccable. Obviously, I realised that he had some sort of degenerative brain condition, I don't know, MS or Parkinson's disease, something like that. But he was still riding. I'd estimate he's definitely somewhere in his 50s or his 60s, but he was riding, and he was riding safely, far more safely than a lot of motorcyclists that I see on the road. Now, I'm hoping he's okay, because so far this year I haven't seen him, but fingers crossed. I mean, we hear of amputees and all sorts of people finding ways of riding motorcycles. And as for age, well, I don't think you're ever too old to ride a motorcycle. I spent 30 seconds Googling the subject this morning, and I came across 2 stories. One was a guy in the United States. Now, I can't remember what bike he was riding, but it just crossed the United States in one go, one trip, on his motorcycle. He's 89 years old. And I found another guy in the United Kingdom who rides a scooter. Now, I don't think he's doing any round the world trips or anything, but he still rides regularly, and he's 101. And it's quite routine for me to read comments on the various videos that I've got running from guys that are in the 70s and even their 80s that are still riding motorcycles. So don't ever think you're too old to be riding a motorcycle. Unless you have an underlying condition that makes it impossible or illegal for you to ride a bike, don't write it off. Now, the old chestnut, what about the dangers of riding a motorcycle? We live in a health and safety conscious sort of nanny existence these days. It's quite different to what it was 20 or 30 years ago. The general consensus seems to be, if there's any risk to doing anything, really, you shouldn't be doing it. Now, I take a pragmatic view of the dangers of motorcycling. For me, the pleasures of motorcycling far outweigh the dangers. I got a few comments on Wednesday of people that were thinking of giving up motorcycle because they'd read reports about an increase in deaths of older motorcyclists whilst riding motorcycles, or they had friends that had packed it in for the same reason. I even had a retired policeman who lives in the Yorkshire Dales National Park expressing his worries about aging motorcyclists buying motorcycles that were just way too powerful to be sensible, killing themselves on the roads in the area that he lives in, because it is a mecca for motorcycles. It's the great motorcycling roads. But I think he hit the nail on the head, really. These were guys that were motorcycling for the wrong reasons. It was all about power and speed for them, They were riding beyond the capabilities on bikes that they were unable to realistically control, which eventually ended up in their deaths. That's not what motorcycling is about. It's not about power and speed, and if that's the mindset you have, my advice is just don't take up motorcycling. Either way, there is an increased risk to you as a motorcyclist for obvious reasons, but I take a pragmatic view of those risks. In my former occupation, I would hazard a guess that I would see more death and destruction in a month than your average person sees in a lifetime. My experience is that people rarely die quietly, quickly and painlessly in the sleep. Our demise, undoubtedly, most of us feel it. And it can come from any direction, whether that's falling down the stairs at home, falling off a stepladder while you're painting your ceiling, or slipping as you're getting into the bath and then losing consciousness and drowning. I've seen it all. Like everybody, I don't really know how much time I've got left. It could be 10 years, it could be 20 years, it could be longer. I've got no idea, and I don't know how that death will occur. But one thing that I'm certain about is that I don't want to spend the rest of my life, no matter how long that is, wrapping myself up in cotton wool and avoiding anything that might be hazardous to me. That is no way, in my opinion, to live the rest of your life. It would just make me miserable. Now, it's up to you as an individual to sort of risk assess whether or not you want to take up motorcycling or come back to motorcycling. But rest assured, your behaviour as a motorcyclist is down to you, and if you behave properly, it can go a long way towards mitigating any potential danger. Can't exclude it completely, but it goes a long way. Right, so finally, a few tips, a little bit of advice on how to go back to motorcycling or how to take up motorcycling in your later years, if that's something you want to do. Now, one thing that does often crop up, it seems that guys get back into motorcycling because the mates have got back into motorcycling or the mates have taken up motorcycling. That's all well and good, but be careful because, with that sort of scenario can come peer pressure. Peer pressure to ride in a certain way and peer pressure to ride certain types of motorcycles. Now, obviously, it's not going to be the case with everybody, but my experience of that sort of scenario riding with friends is a lot of them have very childish egos. Even with older guys, riding with them can often devolve into an egotistical race to prove who's the best and fastest rider. Stay away from those sort of scenarios. I'm not saying don't take up or retake up motorcycling if they've piqued your interest. What I'm saying is you don't necessarily have to ride with them if that is their mindset. In the past, I've found myself riding with friends, sometimes even one friend, where the entire trip just turned up into a complete trial by ordeal where, the circumstances of the ride were just not safe, and I had to back away from that in the end because it's only going to end one way eventually. And the same goes for the choice of motorcycle. Now, if you're returning to motorcycling, you'll be entitled to legally, here in the UK anyway, ride just about any motorcycle that you can afford. If you have to start from fresh and take all the necessary tests, you're going to be limited to an A2 for a while, which I think is a good thing. In the real world, you don't need anything that pumps out more than 50 brake horsepower on the public roads in the UK, whether it be a small to medium capacity bike. A bike with that sort of power output will outmaneuver and outperform most cars on the road. You don't need anything more powerful. To put it into perspective, horsepower is generally measured in horsepower per tonne, not outright horsepower. Your average car has around about 130 brake horsepower at its disposal, but your average car weighs anywhere between 1.4 and 1.8 tonnes. Now, taking the lighter of those values, a 1.4 tonne car with 130 brake horsepower at its disposal has a power to weight ratio of 92 horsepower per tonne, and it will be a pretty sprightly car at that. A motorcycle weighing round about 200 kilograms, so that's about a fifth of a tonne, with 50 brake horsepower, will have a power to weight ratio of over 200 brake horsepower per tonne. Twice as powerful. High-powered, big power motorcycles are just a marketing tool to appeal to weak minds. The actual power that they're able to output is far beyond what you can possibly use on public roads. In fact, your average rider would probably struggle to use it on a proper racetrack. It's up to you, but my advice is do not fall for the bigger and the more powerful is better argument. It's a load of crap. Big bikes are frustrating to ride because, you're constantly having to rein them in. You can't use them to the full extent, and that is the attraction of smaller, low-powered bikes. They're far more rewarding to ride because you can use them almost to the limits of the performance. In the right conditions, they are more enjoyable bikes to ride. Riding a motorcycle is not about sticking it in top gear and then it just doing whatever you want it to do. There's no skill in that. The skill and enjoyment of riding a motorcycle is knowing how to use your gearbox and getting the best out of the power that you have available to you without putting yourself in danger or breaking any laws. A lot of people see, riding motorcycles as being an excuse for riding in a way that they wouldn't conduct themselves in a car. When you're riding among traffic, the safest option is just to move with the traffic, not to be constantly overtaking every car that comes in your path. That's not safe, responsible motorcycling. So when it comes to choosing a motorcycle, go for something that you feel comfortable with, that isn't intimidating. And one rule of thumb, now I know going back to my police riding days, if you had your bike on its prop stand or side stand when you got on it or got off it, it would be an instant failure of the course, because the mindset was that if you couldn't get on or off your motorcycle without it being on the side stand, it was considered that you didn't have proper control of that motorcycle. It was too big for you, it was too heavy for you, or you were too weak. It would be an instant failure. And even in the old motorcycle tests, you would be marked down for getting on or off your bike with the prop stand down. You'll see a lot of guys on these big bikes who are incapable of getting on or off the motorcycles without the assistance of the side stands. They are not masters of their motorcycles are mastering them. And when it comes to reach to the floor, ideally you should be able to flat foot on the bike that you choose. It's not essential, but you should certainly be able to have enough of your foot in contact with the floor that you've got adequate control of the motorcycle. If you can't do that, it is going to compromise your use of the motorcycle, or if you have to stop on uneven surfaces, or if you have to support the weight of the bike while a pillion gets on board, you should be able to master that motorcycle in any situation, even if it's picking it up off the ground if it falls over. Handling a bike properly is not just about, being able to ride it. There's more to it than that. Now, to make this a bit easier, when you're coming back to bikes or you want to start riding bikes, especially if you have a sedentary lifestyle, buy yourself a set of dumbbells, a cheap set of dumbbells. They don't have to be particularly heavy, and do 10 or 20 minutes worth of gentle training about 3 times a week or more if you can handle it. There's no need to go buying a big expensive multi-gym. In fact, multi-gyms are less useful than free weights. Free weights don't just exercise your arm muscles or whatever it is that you're training on. They exercise your entire body, including your core muscles, because they use every muscle in your body to keep your body steady while you're moving those weights around. A lot like manhandling a bike. Multi-gyms don't do that. And if you're one of those people that struggles to get your bike up on its centre stand, or you can't get on and off it without your prop stand, you will be surprised. A month's worth of light training with weights will equip you with enough strength to be able to do that in a way that you wondered why you used to have a problem. A little bit of weight training can increase your strength substantially. So, in a nutshell, make sure that you're fit enough to handle a bike and don't overtax yourself with something that's too big, too heavy, and too powerful. And last but not least, if you can, if you've been away from bikes for a long time, take a remedial course to refresh your memory and get back some of those old skills that you may have lost. I hope this video has been useful to you. If it has, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you're not already a subscriber. It really helps me out. You can help me out in other ways via the Patreon page or the super thanks button down below. Either way, it's much appreciated. I am, of course, going to be back next week, so until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.